This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Last week, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban announced that he was seeking to redefine the terms of Hungary's NATO membership. Ever since the start of the war in Ukraine, Orban has had quite a turbulent relationship with NATO, blocking military aid to Ukraine, delaying NATO expansion, and cozying up with authoritarian Eastern leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. So in this video, we're going to have a look at Hungary's relationship with NATO, how Orban is looking to change Hungary's membership, and how this could affect the alliance more widely. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So first, let's start with a brief history of Hungary's membership in NATO. Compared to Hungary's toxic relationship with the EU, Hungary has had pretty cordial relations with NATO since joining in 1999. Hungary was among the first former members of the Soviet-era Warsaw Pact to join NATO, which Orban described as finally anchoring Hungary to the western coast. Since then, Hungary participated in NATO missions abroad, including in Afghanistan and Iraq, and led the alliance's peacekeeping efforts in Kosovo. Now, we should mention that Orban has been around for a long time. He's been Prime Minister since 2010, but also held office from 1998 to 2002. And over the years, he's steadily become more and more authoritarian. In 2014, for instance, in a now infamous speech about illiberal democracy, Orban described Russia, along with China and Turkey, as a model state for Hungary. While this authoritarian tilt has always been a concern for NATO, it didn't really bother the alliance, as much as it bothered the EU anyway. But following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Orban's politics really started to become a problem for NATO. When the war began, Orban immediately condemned Russia's invasion. But whilst NATO had already started coming up with plans for sending weapons to Ukraine, Orban refused to do so, or even allow weapons to transit Hungary, as a matter of national security. He argued that Hungary must stay out of the conflict and guarantee the safety of the 150,000 Hungarians living in Ukraine, around 30 of which have died on the front lines. Orban took a self-described pro-peace stance and depicted the war as one between two Slavic nations, in which NATO involvement would be unnecessary. Relations with NATO really began to turn sour when Hungary, alongside Turkey, blocked Sweden and Finland's bid to get into the transatlantic club, a key priority for the alliance since the start of the war. Whilst Hungary, after 2 years, ratified both NATO bids, Orban still refused to send weapons to Ukraine, and criticised NATO for refusing to consider a ceasefire. Orban has become increasingly vocal in his criticism since several member states proposed new plans to get the alliance further involved in the conflict. For instance, Lithuania has suggested that the alliance should train Ukrainian troops in Ukraine, rather than in other European countries, and France has similarly announced plans, with Kyiv, to do exactly this. Similarly, the incumbent Secretary-General has called on NATO allies supplying weapons to Ukraine to end their prohibition on using them to strike military targets in Russia. These new proposals come 6 weeks before NATO's summit, where the alliance is seeking to draw up a fresh long-term support strategy for Ukraine. Apparently, in reaction to these new proposals, last week Orban announced in an interview on Hungarian national radio that Hungary will seek to redefine its NATO membership. Orban said that his government will be looking at how Hungary could exist as a NATO member without taking part in NATO operations outside of NATO territory. He continued to explain that a new term has been invented to describe the Hungarian position in NATO. It's called non-participation. Now, as dramatic as this might sound, Hungary's non-participation policy is probably consistent with NATO's charter, as it currently stands. Politicians often make it sound like Article 5 implies some ironclad commitment to mutual defence. In other words, if one NATO member triggers Article 5, then all the other members have to send their full armies out to help. But that's not actually what the treaty says. In fact, Article 5 only requires that other member states assist as much as they deem necessary. Article 5 was deliberately phrased in this ambiguous way because when NATO's charter was being drawn up in the 40s, the US didn't want to be automatically obliged to help Europe in the event of another war. Hungary thus doesn't need a new non-participation clause. If they don't want to help, in Ukraine or elsewhere, they can just not help. And if another NATO country triggers Article 5, they could just say that they don't deem their support necessary, or that they only deem only the bare minimum to be necessary. The only material change Orban could make would be to leave NATO, but he obviously won't do this, given it's basically free security for Hungary, and as irritating as Orban might be, NATO has no mechanism for expelling existing members. So if Hungary isn't actually required to participate in NATO exercises anyway, why is Orban saying all this stuff? Well, he might be looking to protect his relationship with Putin. Despite condemning Russia in the war, Orban clearly wants to maintain at least cordial ties with the Kremlin, and undermining NATO unity is an effective way of courting Putin. But perhaps the main reason is domestic. Ahead of the European elections, Orban has smeared his political opposition as warmongers and presented himself as a force for peace, battling against the Western war machine, and even characterised the upcoming election as a choice between war and peace. Fidesz has put up billboards across the country criticising the Western sanctions policy, with some posters shouting war and depicting opposition politicians. These sorts of statements about non-participation, even if they don't really amount to a substantial policy change, are an effective way for Orban to signal his pro-peace credentials to the Hungarian electorate. Perhaps the most interesting question is whether the other relatively more pro-Russia countries in NATO follow suit. Hungary isn't the only country in the alliance who's a staunch opponent of sending military aid to Ukraine. The leaders of both Bulgaria and Slovakia, for instance, also share similar views. The president of Bulgaria has described Ukraine's victory over Russia as impossible, while Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico announced he would stop sending military aid to Ukraine last October, and earlier this year condemned NATO proposals to send soldiers into Ukraine. These other countries might also declare themselves non-participating members vis-à-vis Ukraine, creating de facto two levels of NATO membership between participating and non-participating countries, and undermining unity within the alliance. When making videos like this, we rely on tons of data analysis to interpret crucial economic data and understand political decisions. But this kind of analysis isn't just crucial for our jobs. As our world becomes more driven by AI and data, your job will likely require more analytical skills too. That's why we've been using Brilliant. Brilliant is the STEM learning platform which can teach you all the skills you'll need in an increasingly digital workplace. They've just introduced a whole collection of new programming and LLM courses, suitable for learners at any level, taking you through everything from learning Python to understanding the importance of training data. And Brilliant isn't just about memorization and lectures. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise quite complex topics, and ensuring that you actually understand what's going on, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. All of Brilliant's courses are split into easy-to-digest chunks, meaning you can quickly and easily gain real knowledge in just a few minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have time, replacing mindless scrolling on the bus or waiting for coffee with something stimulating and rewarding. To gain access to Brilliant for free for a full 30 days, head to brilliant.org/TLDR. Or click the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support.